Hi everyone, it's Andrew again. Following on from our example of writing some API calls, we're going to write a test for it. This is something we want for almost every function that we write or every unit that we write. And in general, we are putting tests in a double underscored tests folder as close to the thing that we're testing as possible. And then we'll use the test runner to go and find them all. And typically, because we're using Ava, we're using a .spec.js extension to identify the test, and this also helps us to stop picking it up in production builds. So here's one I've already made. Just to recap, we created a series of test routes, API health with different parameters, and a controller which simply returned a JSON object which reflected back some of those parameters in the query. And so in the test, we are going to simply use supertest, which we wrap in an instance of our server. And this allows us to make calls to that server without having to go through an HTTP transport. Essentially, we call them directly. The syntax is really easy to follow. We're calling an HTTP GET on this path, setting any request parameters, request headers that we need to do. In this case, we're saying we want JSON, and then we expect back a 200 OK, and then we expect the content type to be JSON. And there's lots of options that you can put on the expect in supertest that validate the response. And in this case, if any of these fails, they'll run an assert and the overall test will fail. But we're also doing an enzyme check here. So we're saying that the body of the result has to be an object, which we're calling health, and it should have a member parameter which has a string of OK, which is, as you saw before, is what we're returning. So when we run this, if I just take this out for the moment, you'll see, and I'll make this only. So this is the only one in the test that will run. And here, so we're running npm test, and then the double star says, go and look anywhere in the tree for the matching health spec.js. So we don't have to worry about which folder it was in. And what if you've just written any of these tests, you'll be surprising to see that we're expecting a 200 OK, but we got a 404 not found. So the server said this path doesn't exist, and this could cause you to scratch your head for some time. So the reason is that in the server, when we include it, it calls this app prepare function, which sets up all of the Next.js and server functionality. So it takes some time, it's asynchronous, and then when it completes, it calls a then function, which is where we are attaching all of the extras to the server, in which includes when we're attaching the server the API routes. So if the code hasn't got to this point, and when we make the call, we won't find our route, and this is why we're getting a 404 back. So this takes a few seconds to get running. And so the way I've handled this is that we can see that because that prepare has a then function, that means it's a promise. It returns a promise. And so we can capture that promise in a variable called appReady. And we return that, as well as exporting from the server itself, we export this promise. So then here in health spec, we import that promise again, as well as the server. The server's needed so that we can call the supertest functions on it. But before we get started, we just wait for appReady to complete. So we're using async await in quite a lot of our code. It makes writing asynchronous code really simple, except when you forget to wait for something to be ready. And so in the test here, we're saying the function that we're passing to the test is asynchronous. And then that means that whenever you see an await statement, it will go off and wait for that promise to resolve. before continuing with the rest of the function. And so it makes the function look quite easy to read because you can step through it sequentially, read through it sequentially. But in terms of runtime, it will actually go off and do other stuff at each of these awaits. And so the last few lines of this are equivalent to what you'd have to put in a callback or a then statement attached to one of these other statements. So it's very clean code. But, so remember to put the await at ready at the beginning of the test. Otherwise, your server won't be ready. So having done that, we've got a couple of different tests. The first one just makes a call to the basic API, and so the only thing we were looking for in the result is an OK. The next one, we pass in the extended path, so we're saying we want our URL after the word health, these to be considered as parameters. And we've set it up so that they're returned back in the object that we get as a result, so we can test that param1, which is the first one there, is equivalent to whatever we wrote in this URL here. And then the third test is checking our query parameters, so that's the calls after the question mark. And so again here we can test that query A is 1 and query B is of length 21. So query B looks like an array, a JavaScript array, but it is actually being returned as query as a string, so it's 21 characters long. If we want to interpret that as a JavaScript object, it's JSON, so we have to parse it, and then we can test it as an array of length 3. And so these tests should all work. Now, tests that are involving loading the server are inherently slow in comparison to simple functional or unit tests on components. So we want the test code coverage, and we want as many of them as possible, but we don't want to call them very often. So we may actually separate out slow tests and fast tests in our test runner. As you can see, from just running that single test file, we have hit code in all of these functions, or in all of these modules, including server and routes, the health controller that we wrote, and actually all of the other routing code that was in other API calls, which means that we also included the database entities. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of code that gets hoisted in just to make sure, even though we don't look like we're accessing it. Thank you.